Ever since humanity was invented all the way back in 1969, there have been a plethora of strong alliances. The Allied Powers, God and Jesus, Bulk and Skull, and probably a few others that I'm forgetting about. But for all the great alliances, there were also some stinkers too, like Toothpaste and Orange Juice, God and Shawn Michaels, and... well, my ex-wife Chili and I, but legally I'm not allowed to say anything about that. However, if you were to look right smack dab in the middle of all those awesome and awful alliances, you'd probably find Capcom and the Nintendo Gamecube.
You see, back in the 1980s, Nintendo pretty much ran a monopoly in the video game world, and they used their muscle to keep most of the third-party developers all to themselves. Eventually, Sega manages to do some of these devs into sharing some of their goodies with the Genesis, but even though this did kill the above-average sized den's monopoly, they still had so much third-party support that it didn't really matter. Once the 64 came along, though, Nintendo assumed that third parties would stick around no matter what, because not only did they have twice as many bits as Sony and Sega, but surely all these years of business led to some kind of friendship and loyalty, right? Well, as we all know, when you make an assumption, your ass will ump and shun you, so when developers found out that Nintendo's new console would be using more expensive cartridges that couldn't hold nearly as much data as a CD, just about every reputable third party left N-Dog high and dry. I mean, who would have thought that bullying developers over exclusivity and chips during shortages would lead to them not having any loyalty, right? In the end, the 64 still ended up doing pretty well, though, but it still wasn't nearly as big of a hit as it could have been if Nintendo didn't scare all of its former business partners off. But about halfway through the 64's life cycle, Capcom CEO Frankie Capcom stopped by Nintendo HQ to pick up that Pete Rose rookie card he forgot when he was dropping off Mega Man X3 for the Super Nintendo, and while he was there, he saw Nintendo's president of fun, Shigeru Miyamoto, crying his eyes out. "Why all the crying?" said Frankie to the Shig Master, to which he replied, "All my friends abandoned me so they could hang out with Sony. You gotta help me, man. I'm getting milked out there."
All this actually happened, by the way. It's a fact. Look it up.
Capcom, of course, thought it'd be rude to just leave in the middle of a heart-to-heart, so in an attempt to cheer Nintendo up, he decided to re-gift a few games like Resident Evil 2 and Mega Man Legends, and he even went on to promise a few original titles just as long as he could make it home in time to watch the TV version of Billy Madison with the deleted kickball scene. Fast forward a few years later, Nintendo had released the GameCube that finally used discs over cartridges, so surely nothing could stop Nintendo now, right? Well, apparently that's what Nintendo thought anyway, which is why their general manager was stressing to the public that they were refusing to approach third parties for games just months before the console launched, because apparently they expected third parties to come to them once the GameCube's install base started growing. And as if that claim wasn't cocky enough, Nintendo's actual president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, went out of his way to tell the press that it's not a race to see how many, quote, useless developers you can get on your side. And then shortly after that, Satoru Iwata was publicly making fun of third parties for releasing the same games on multiple consoles, because screw making money, am I right?
These quotes are even more outlandish than those stories I made about Miyamoto crying to Capcom.
Needless to say, Nintendo daring third parties to choose the PlayStation 2 didn't exactly work out too well for the GameCube. I mean, what they did was pretty much the same thing as a parent dropping their son off for his first day at a new school and daring all the bullies to pick on him. Despite a lackluster first year of sales on the GameCube, though, Capcom stayed true to their word and held a press release proclaiming that they had 5 games in development for the GameCube that a US representative confirmed would be exclusives to the console, but then Capcom of Japan immediately shot this down and stressed that only Resident Evil 4 was going to be exclusive.
Then they went on to spank the Capcom USA representative's ass till it was cherry red. And I'm not even lying about this one, I read it on 4chan, so... Despite the fact that what's since been dubbed as the Capcom 5 weren't all going to be exclusives, though, Capcom managed to deliver 2 games that would be exclusive, at least for over a decade anyway. One was a remake of the first Resident Evil game, and the other was a prequel called Resident Evil 0. The original Resident Evil on the PlayStation, and Sega Saturn for anyone who's counting, may have been a revolutionary game and all that, but even back in 2002, there was a lot about it that just didn't hold up well at all, mainly with the voice acting.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Resident Evils 2 and 3 weren't perfect either, even in the voice acting department, but since Capcom wouldn't be embarrassed about those for another 20 years or so, they'd gone to port them onto just about everything, including the friggin' Gamecom of all things. When it came to Resident Evil 1, though, God forbid Capcom ever claimed it as a dependent on their taxes, hence the remake on the GameCube in 2002. And when I say remake, I don't mean just an upgraded port with new character models. They burned the original to the friggin' ground and remade it from scratch. The mansion was bigger, the graphics were incredible, they added a new boss, and the voiceovers were recorded with actual actors that they didn't just find under a bridge. Plus, if you didn't burn zombies' bodies quick enough after putting them down, they'd get up even stronger, chase you down, and have you scream at the top of your lungs at like 2 in the morning, which my 80-year-old Polish grandma did not appreciate at the time. Even though there were probably a few fans of the first game who were disappointed to not get as many ports as the other Resident Evils, though, I'd say that it was worth it for the remake. Besides, if you're that nostalgic over the first game, then the DS had a pretty good port a few years later with bad voice acting and all. But as great as the remake was, though, it didn't really move the needle all that much for the GameCube, probably because most people didn't understand that it was a full-blown remake and just kind of assumed that it was a port, or I don't know, at least that's why I held that anyway. Sorry about that. A few months later, the GameCube would get Capcom vs. SNK 2, which was a pretty solid fighting game, but the problem was that the Xbox also got it on the same day, plus superior versions of it already came out on the PS2 and Dreamcast like a year earlier, so obviously this Capcom offering wouldn't do much for the GameCube, nor would some random UFC game, a point-and-click Mickey Mouse game, or co-publishing a Spider-Man game with Activision in Japan. Before the year was over, though, Capcom did manage to squeak out Resident Evil Zero, a brand new entry to the Resident Evil series that was originally intended for the 64 of all things, but was eventually carried over to the GameCube in hopes of selling more consoles. And according to my research of doing absolutely nothing at all, I can confirm that this game did manage to sell at least one whopping GameCube console. Now, can you guess who the loser with the tiny peep was who bought it?
Hey!
That's right, when I saw a commercial for a brand new Resident Evil game that'd only be available on the GameCube, I knew it was time to strike. Don't get me wrong, I always wanted a GameCube from day one, but this was before I made a living at the proctology firm, so I didn't exactly have a lot of money to spare. Thankfully, I had a little bit of money of my own, what with this game coming out between my birthday and Christmas, and I certainly don't regret buying a new console just to play it. I mean, it's far from the best Resident Evil game. I always thought that getting rid of item boxes in favor of just leaving shit on the ground all over the map was a big downgrade, but the puzzles surrounding the partner system were a fun change in pace, and the graphics blew me away at the time, so overall, I thought it was a great game. I don't know how many consoles it sold beyond me, but I'd like to think that it definitely sweetened the pot as far as the GameCube's library was concerned. That'd be all Capcom wrote for the GameCube in 2002, but in case you couldn't get enough Resident Evil, they decided to port the second and third games over at the very beginning of 2003 to try and make a quick buck during the slowest month of the year. Like, part of me feels like I shouldn't complain over ports, because at the end of the day, no one ever forced me to buy them, and it couldn't have taken them longer than like 5 minutes to copy and paste these onto GameCube discs, so it's not like it delayed any other games or anything like that, but I mean, after seeing how amazing the remake of the first game was, it was still a little disappointing that 2 couldn't have gotten the same treatment. I mean, it was the most popular game in the franchise up until that point, and I can only imagine what a new coat of paint could have done to give the third game a second chance to shine. But nope, Capcom didn't think it was worth it, and with the remake of the first game barely selling 1 million copies, I can't say that I blame them, I guess. I wouldn't blame all of you for not buying it either, but I got a used copy myself, so I guess if anyone deserves to be scolded, it should be me.
Well, I'll tell you, if my ex-wife Chili were here, she sure wouldn't mind scolding me. She'd be all like, why'd you buy a used copy? Why didn't you buy a new to support the developer? Why don't you pay child support? Women, am I right?
The main gripes of the ports for 2 and 3, though, is that they were just copy and pasted over from the PS1 versions, even though the Dreamcast ports were clearly the best ones. Well, you know, outside of the full remakes in 2019 and 2020, of course. To be fair, you could skip cutscenes in the GameCube version, but why leave out all the bonus galleries and the ability to run the game at 60 frames per second? At the end of the day, the GameCube's a completely fine way to play Resident Evils 2 and 3, but the fact that it could have easily been so much better is upsetting to me, like when the photo guy at Kmart sent the absolute worst family photos possible out to my aforementioned Polish grandma.
Sorry, Bobchi.
Once Capcom ran out of Resident Evil, though, they decided to milk their next best franchise with the GameCube-exclusive Mega Man Battle Network transmission, which was actually the third game that I bought for the console, with the second being Die Hard Vendetta, don't ask. I remember seeing this at Software Etc. and thinking, oh man, look at these pictures, I can't wait to play a brand new 2D Mega Man platformer, and with the GameCube's power, oh man, this is gonna be great. I faintly remember the sales guy begging me to read the text on the back, but I just told him that I can't read because I'm not a loser, and then I was on my merry way home. And then I turned the game on, saw this, and thought,
Man, what the hell?
yeah, it didn't take me very long to find out that this was a sequel to the first Battle Network RPG on the Game Boy Advance, and while it is still a platformer, they forced RPG elements to the point where it wasn't a great game for either genre. I'll give Capcom credit for trying something new, but I'm also not gonna blindly praise it either. If I'm being completely honest, I couldn't force myself to get very far into it, so there was a part of me deep down that felt like I might be missing out on a hidden gem over the years, but apparently the opinions on this game are mixed at best, so while I'm sure I did miss out on some fun by being too stubborn to play it for more than like 10 minutes back in the day, I can't imagine that I missed out that much. And based on the fact that it didn't get a sequel on consoles, I'd imagine that it didn't sell very well either. Once March 03 came around, though, we finally got to see the first of the Capcom 5 in a game called, well, I think Piano 3, but it kind of sounds like Piano 3 or Peen 3. The box art says it's product number 3, and according to the title screen, it's PN 3. I guess they thought that leaving the 0 in there made it sound like the third game in the franchise, but if that's the case, then what are you gonna call the sequels? PN 3-2? PN 3-3? PN 369? I know it sounds like I'm being a dick for putting so much thought into the title, but the game did flop pretty hard, so I can't be the only person who looked at this and didn't know what to make of it. The game itself's not what I'd consider a bad game by any means, but it's also not anything special either. It's basically just a third-person shooter where you kill a bunch of disgruntled machines. The graphics are pretty decent for the time, but the entire game looks exactly the same, and the controls are a little clunky by today's standards. They're not too bad, but you can't shoot and move at the same time, and dodging takes forever, so it takes a lot of getting used to. And for a game like this, it's really not worth taking the time to do so, in my opinion, seeing as how there's so many other games I'm trying to play. So, yeah, things might not have gone too smoothly for the first of the Capcom 5, but you know what? That didn't really matter, because the boys and girls at Old Cappy knew that the next game, Viewtiful Joe, would be a banger. A lot of games from this time period tried coming up with all kinds of crazy new ideas with the New Dimension developers had to work with, but with Viewtiful Joe, Capcom decided to take an old concept like 2.5D side-scrolling beat-em-ups and really just go hog wild with it. You play as some bloke named Joe, at least according to my research team on Crack anyway, only for him and his girlfriend Sylvia to get pulled into a movie, and the whole idea is to rescue her with his newfound powers that he gained in this movie world. I know it might look like just another beat 'em up, but there's actually a surprising amount of depth to the combat ability, with plenty of special moves, abilities you need to solve puzzles with in between all the ass whoopings, as well as power-ups you could buy. It's decently challenging, there's plenty of variety in the stages, the cel-shaded graphics look great to this day, there's plenty of funny moments that break the fourth wall, and the game never throws too much at you at once. It's really a perfect combination between old school and new school, although I suppose the game came out a few decades ago, so I guess it's all old school at this point. But with a home run like this, you'd think that GameCubes would have started flying off the shelves, and, well, the game did pretty good for a little bit, but hardly what Capcom and Nintendo were hoping for. Unlike Peen 3, though, Capcom knew Viewtiful Joe was awesome and worth trying to salvage with a PS2 port, but even then, the game still never got the credit it deserved. I think the problem was that 3D gaming was still new enough to where people found anything in 2D to be lazy or not worth playing at this point. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like if this game came out in the Wii, or especially the Switch era, then it would have probably done a hell of a lot better. In fact, even all these years later, I still think it'd do great on the Switch, which is why I'm surprised Capcom hasn't given Viewtiful Joe the old HD remaster treatment. With 2 of the big 5 failing to light the world on fire, though, Capcom would take a little extra time on the next 3 to help cheer Nintendo up once and for all, so in the meantime, they decided to put some multiplats out to fill the void. First one was a racing game called Automodelista, and looked really cool, but ultimately it was just a decent racing game that you could also get on the PS2, and a year earlier than that if you lived in Japan. And then they finally ported Resident Evil Code Veronica over from the Dreamcast, because it was literally the last mainline Resident Evil game not on the console at this point, so might as well, you know. Much like the ports for 2 and 3, though, I thought the Dreamcast version was a little better, mainly because it didn't spoil the game on the main menu, and you could also use the VMU memory card, which the GameCube didn't have. For the most part, this is pretty much the exact same game that was only ported over because the Dreamcast underperformed even worse than the GameCube did. So, I can't exactly blame Capcom for wanting somebody to actually play what's essentially the true Resident Evil 3. Version differences aside, though, this is probably my least favorite mainline Resident Evil game, just because of all the malarkey that comes with switching characters without any warning while sharing the same item box. Nothing else, though, the game did leave a lasting impact on me, seeing as I'm still having nightmares over this guy. Not long after Code Veronica, though, the third of the big 5 games Capcom was supposed to have in store for Nintendo, Dead Phoenix, ended up being canceled altogether. There's not a whole lot that's known about this game, but apparently it was supposed to be about a winged gunman shooting somebody or something, kind of like Panzer Dragoon, but for reasons we might never know, Capcom decided to scrap it altogether. In fact, they actually just kind of refused to talk about it altogether anymore, so it's technically not canceled, but the odds of this game ever coming out anywhere, let alone the GameCube, are about as good as my odds of getting my egg bills paid on time. While it may have been disheartening for 3 of the Capcom 5 to come up short in trying to carry the GameCube to greatness, though, Capcom still managed to release an exclusive title in December of 2003 called Gotcha Force, which is basically Capcom's attempt at Pokemon, except this is a fighting slash third-person shooter as opposed to a turn-based RPG, and instead of living creatures, you collect machines called Borgs, I guess so you wouldn't have to feel bad about making them violently assault each other. The graphical style and story seem pretty fun to me, and while the gameplay is known to be repetitive, you could also say the same thing about Pokemon, and that franchise ended up doing alright. This game seemed like something I would have enjoyed, but the reviewers weren't particularly kind to it back in the day, and on top of that, nobody even knew what it was due to the poor marketing, but the people who did like this game seemed to enjoy it so much that the game could have gotten a restraining order against them if it wanted to. Sadly for Capcom and the GameCube, though, Gotcha Force only sold about 30,000 copies worldwide, and it's expensive as all hell on eBay right now. The cult following did lead to the game getting another batch made in Japan in 2012, long after the GameCube was already dead and buried, with the hope being that the second chance could lead to a sequel, but sadly, that's pretty much the last the world ever heard of this Pokemon clone. Seeing as how most people have no clue this game even exists, though, I can't help but wonder if it could have taken off with better marketing. I guess we'll never know, though. At this point, you can't help but feel bad for Capcom, because outside of a few harmless ports, they really did take their chances and put a lot of effort into the GameCube, but still haven't struck oil. Surely their fortunes would turn around with Disney's hide and seek, though, because I mean, look at it. There's no way this game won't be an all-time classic, and as a GameCube exclusive, how could it not sell a few million consoles at the very least? Well, as fate would have it, this Mickey Mouse game revolved around hide and seek somehow got poor reviews and nobody bothered to give it the time of day, including myself.
Go figure.
To be fair, the graphics were pretty decent at the time, I guess, but other than that, what the hell could I say about this? It's just a random nothing-happening Mickey Mouse game. What I can talk about, though, is the Mega Man Anniversary Collection that came out in June of 2004 that was apparently only a thing in North America, and I never really knew that until now. I'm guessing this compilation didn't come out in Japan because they already had the first 6 Mega Man games re-released for the PS1, and, well, Europe probably didn't get it because they never get nice things, except for Wily Wars anyway. But my god, this right here might be the GameCube game that I played the most, which, on one hand, is kind of sad given that most of the titles in this compilation were over 10 years old at the time, but damn it, they were still some of my all-time favorite games ever made. Man, I never really got the chance to play Mega Man 6 through 8 before this, so it was basically like 3 new Mega Man games with 5 classics, and there were a ton of extras in this game that the Legacy Collection cheaped out on, like ports of the 2 arcade fighting games and a G4 documentary about how Mega Man was created in the first place. And not only was it nice to be able to play Mega Man games at an age where I could actually use my brain and not die on the first screen, but being able to save my progress was pretty bitchin' too. The emulation was pretty good overall, but it always bugged me how the music would fade out before restarting again, as opposed to just looping, but it wasn't exactly a deal breaker or anything like that. I may have been disappointed in that Battle Network game, but this was the Mega Man that I wanted, and I enjoyed every second of it.
That's more like it.
As much as I personally loved this Mega Man compilation, though, it wasn't exactly the kind of game that'd get the GameCube knighted, especially when it also came out on the Xbox and PS2. So, even though it didn't exactly hurt the GameCube's library, Capcom still had a long way to go on their quest to carry the GameCube to greatness. After releasing the Mega Man Anniversary Collection, though, Capcom decided to keep the Mega Madness coming with a turn-based RPG Mega Man X spin-off of all things called Command Mission. Granted, they just got done pumping out Mega Man X games before this, and it wouldn't be too long before they gave us X8 after this, but, I mean, who would have thought? A Battle Network game with platforming elements and a Mega Man X turn-based RPG on the GameCube? To be fair though, Command Mission wasn't exclusive to the GameCube, but still funny to me. I've only ever actually played this game for like one session over 5 years ago, but from what I can understand, it was made by a lot of the same people who made the Breath of Fire games, and it's pretty simplistic gameplay and story-wise. I know that some people really like this game, and I might too if I ever actually found the time to play it myself, but if you're gonna be bold enough to make a Mega Man X RPG, then why half-ass the RPG elements? It's like, either make us Breath of Fire 5 or give us a full-fledged Mega Man X RPG, you know? But then again, Paper Mario turned out to be pretty good after Super Mario RPG, so maybe I should just play Command Mission for myself. But I mean, let's be real though, I'm not gonna play this over the other 87 RPGs I got in my backlog. At any rate though, Command Mission didn't do jack poop for the GameCube, but maybe Capcom's next game would do the trick. Well, what do you know, despite not lighting the world on fire, Viewtiful Joe did in fact end up getting a sequel, because Capcom knew damn well this game had every right to be a huge success if only people would give it the chance. Now that it wasn't limited to just the GameCube, maybe, just maybe, it sold about as well as the first game did. I mean, for a sequel that only really had to add to the foundation of the original as opposed to building something entirely new from scratch, by no means could that be considered a failure. Still though, the Viewtiful Joe games really should have flown off the shelves, but for some reason, a lot of us only recently discovered how great they were long after the fact, so again, if anybody at Capcom's watching this, and we all know you are, then please, for the love of my neighbor Terry, put these games out on modern consoles and make a sequel. I mean, hey, worked for No More Heroes, so why not Viewtiful Joe?
I know that saying that's just going to date this video, since surely Capcom's going to remaster these games at some point, but just know that whenever they do that, the only reason they did so is because of this video and because of me, so you're welcome.
Okay, so what's the deal with Viewtiful Joe 2? What makes the sequel stand out from the original? Well, I didn't play this one nearly as much as the original, but based on what I did play, I think I could agree with fans of the series in that this isn't quite as fresh as the first game was, but still every bit as good. You can play as Joe's girlfriend, Sexy Sylvia, now, but for some reason, there's still no two-player co-op, which is pretty baffling for a beat-em-up to exclude in a sequel with two playable characters, if you ask me. The game's just as charming and wacky as the original was, and while it didn't bring a whole lot of new ideas to the table, it did more than enough with the old ideas for this to add value to any game library. Might not have been enough to propel the GameCube into superstardom, which wasn't gonna happen with it being on the PS2 anyway, but it was still a pretty good way to buy a little more time for the last two Capcom 5 games. Provided they didn't get canceled anyway, which I wouldn't say almost happened with Resident Evil 4, but given how different the early gameplay was, I bet Nintendo was a little startled that the game might not happen. Thankfully though, Capcom's hard work finally paid off when Resident Evil 4 did in fact get people's attention in a very big way in January of 2005. Despite the fact that trying new ideas bit them on the ass multiple times in the GameCube, Capcom was somehow able to take zombies out of a Resident Evil game and have people give it an honest and fair chance. Pretty bold of them to attempt considering that Zelda fans threw the mother of all hissy fits when and Wind Waker dared to have a different art style. And it's not like Resident Evil 4 just replaced zombies with some other monster and called it a day. No. They straight up changed the entire genre from survival horror into action. Back in this time period, I was genuinely horrified at Resident Evil games, and after having finished the remake of the first one not too long before this came out, I wasn't mentally ready to handle it if I'm being honest, because I thought it was going to be the scariest one of all of them.
I was still a former T-ball MVP though, so frig off.
Once I finally got around to it over a year later though, I found that the only two things in the entire game that scared me at all were the Garradors and the Chainsaw guys, but even then, nothing came close to being as scary as this guy. But you know what? I didn't give a monkey's nutsack, because I was having a blast the entire way through, and I even replayed this game more times than I can count, just like the millions of other people who did as well. So with a hit like this, you'd think that Nintendo would finally be satisfied with a true third-party killer app being on the GameCube, right? Well, they definitely benefited a lot, but since the GameCube hadn't really been as big of a hit as anybody had hoped for, Capcom wasn't about to lock all of their hard work on a console that only had like an eighth of the install base as its competitors, so they announced a few months before the release date that Resident Evil 4 would be coming to the PS2 less than a year after the GameCube's release. I'm sure Nintendo was bummed about this, but it's not Capcom's job to do all the work in carrying Nintendo's consoles, so I don't blame them for trying to make sure as many people were able to play their game as possible while it was still fresh. Still though, I bet N-Dog was bummed that Capcom didn't wait at least a year to announce the game would go multiplat. The graphics on the GameCube version of RE4 were an ass hair better, but if you could accept Fire not looking as good, then the PS2 version was definitely the way to go since it had a considerable amount of bonus gameplay. While Resident Evil 4 may not have turned the tides for the GameCube, pretty much nothing was gonna by 2005, and it still did a lot of good for the platinum-colored lunchbox, so no matter how you look at it, this was a pretty big success for Nintendo and Capcom. In fact, it was such a big hit that pretty much everybody forgot about the last game in the so-called Capcom 5 Killer 7, which Capcom only published, so I don't know why exclusives like Gotcha Force and Resident Evil 0 aren't considered important enough to be considered the Capcom 6 or 7, especially when one of the original 5 never even came out, at least not yet anyway.
Never say never.
Since Capcom apparently had their thumb stuck in their bum though, the same team who'd eventually formed Suda51 stepped up to the plate to make Killer 7. And if you played any of the other Suda games like No More Heroes, then it's pretty obvious that they made this too. Much like Hideo Kojima, Shikasato Itoy, and Quentin Tarantino, Suda51 leave their own distinct fingerprints on their projects that nobody else could ever duplicate. The gameplay gets pretty repetitive by the end, and honestly, playing an on-rail shooter with analog controls just feels wrong. But I still think it's pretty cool that you can switch characters out that all have their own strengths anytime you want, depending on the situation. Kinda feels like if Little Samson were an on-rail shooter, except a little bit less fun due to the lack of a light gun or pointer controls. But even so, Killer 7's got a graphical style that still looks incredible to this day, and proves once and for all that cell shading was definitely the way to go if you wanted games from the early 2000s to look good forever.
I told PJ Sullivan that Wind Waker was onto something, but no, he didn't want to let me bum $1 because he thought it was too unreasonable. Well, look who's laughing now, PJ. I got the Ocarina of Time bonus disc, no thanks to you, asshole. PJ, you're probably never going to see this, but if you're watching, I'm just kidding.
The story's surprisingly complex and genuinely interesting, and the voice acting's light years ahead of its time. The game ended up coming out on the PS2 as well, but it still didn't move the needle all that much for either console, and for whatever it's worth, the game ended up coming out on Steam years later, but I think the gameplay's a little too dated to make too much of an impact in the modern day. And I mean, it definitely still has its hardcore fans who are probably gonna get pissed at me in the comments for saying that, and I don't know, I still think it's pretty cool. Just wasn't enough to save the GameCube's all. With Capcom's Big 5 journey officially ending with the release of Killer 7 though, they'd only end up releasing 2 more games on the GameCube. The first was a Viewtiful Joe spin-off called Red Hot Rumble that came out in September of 2005, which was pretty much a 2D fighter that felt like if Smash Bros. And WarioWare tried to have a baby, but failed due to a weak sperm count and had no other choice but to adopt from Viewtiful Joe. Sounds like a pretty good idea on paper, and for the most part it's not a bad game at all, but it's hardly worth going out of your way to check out if you're not already a fan of the first 2 games or the anime that I had no idea even existed before I made this video. And then finally, the very last game Capcom released on the GameCube turned out to be the Mega Man X collection that once again only came out in North America. But don't feel too bad about this one, my un-American friends, because Mega Man X on the GameCube is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It comes with X 1 through 6 and the kart racer Mega Man Battle and Chase, which Europe actually already had, so now I don't feel as bad. And like, the games that are included are fine, but the sound effects on some of them kinda suck. This is probably because they used the PS1 version for X3, and that's not all bad. I like me some PS1 cutscenes, but the sound effects are just different than they were on the Super Nintendo, and for whatever reason, they're just plain quiet on the GameCube. Not only that, but all the voiceovers were removed from X6 supposedly to save space, but like, you bozos were the ones who decided to port the games over in the first place. So like, why didn't they do it right, you know? Also, this might just be me, but I can't friggin' stand playing Mega Man X with a GameCube controller. Don't get me wrong, I love this controller. most of the time. But whenever I play Mega Man X, the very first thing I do is reconfigure the dash button from Y to R because I'm not a lunatic, but I'd rather pay child support than have to dash or change weapons using the spring triggers on the GameCube controller. These buttons work great for shooting guns in other games, but I need something solid to dash reliably, and in Mega Man X, dashing's like 70% of the game, and to make matters worse, Capcom even went out of their way to make the Mega Man X GameCube controller specifically for this game, but the button layout's still the same, so what's the friggin' point? So yeah, if you want to play Mega Man X, then either get the Legacy Collection on modern consoles, overpay for a copy on eBay, or just friggin' emulate before you ever consider getting the compilation on the GameCube. Unless of course you're a collector, it's kind of fun to own.
In the end though, I think Capcom's Big Five actually ended up hurting the GameCube in more ways than just not selling consoles. Don't get me wrong, Capcom definitely did do a lot of good for the GameCube, but their partnership with Nintendo was kind of looked at as the big test to see if the GameCube really was worth developing for, and after all their underwhelming bangs, I think other developers just kind of looked at it as confirmation that the PS2 was the place to be. But I'm not blaming Capcom by any means though, they did just about everything they could to boost the GameCube. Nah, I'm blaming Nintendo for practically begging third parties to develop games for Sony's DVD player. I mean, when you're publicly calling developers useless and stupid, not even Capcom can get them to join the party, which is a real shame too, because the GameCube is one of my all-time favorite consoles, and I always thought it was kind of weird I was like the only one in my high school who truly appreciated it. But you know what, even though the GameCube may have been discontinued for over a decade now, I'm still not giving hope that some third parties might end up supporting the console after all. And look, I'll be the 13th or 14th person to tell you that I don't know anything about game design, but I do know a thing or two about bringing people together, and I think that I just might be able to do what Cap don't and finally bring some third parties at the GameCube party. And there. Now we go undercover.
Hello, my friend. It is me, Mario. Now tell me, are you from Naughty Dog?
No, I'm Chip from Craigslist. I'm here for pizza, booze, and ass, and well, I just had the last of my pizza and booze.
Uh-oh, not again! Why do my videos always end like this?
Oh good, we finally caught that donkey.
Haha, you can't demonetize me, it was just a donkey.
Yeah, now bend over, boy.
Oh,